Okay, so as I said, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Nancy Dome. And Nancy is the founder and CEO of Epoch Education. Her organization actually works with LEAs and other organizations, business groups around California and probably other places as well. And basically it's to support equity. So equity in the organizations and also providing professional development for those individuals to have equitable organizations. So with that, I'm just going to pass it on to Dr. Nancy Dome. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm glad to be here, and thank you for joining me at the end of your day. I know there's other places you might rather be, but I'm glad you're here with me and that we're here together. It is going to be interactive, so you don't have to move now, but there will be an invitation to get up and talk to folks that are actually not with you, not from your site, just to be able to step a little bit into that experience, some of the discomfort of engaging in the conversations that we need to engage in and not doing it with people that we talk to every day that we feel very comfortable with. So how do we have these conversations with the folks we don't feel that comfortable with, right? So to begin us off, we're looking at the connection between disproportionality and relationships. And if you've seen me speak before, you'll know that a lot of my work is about using equity as a lens, as something that we look through and not something that we do. It's not something that we do in isolation, but part of using equity as a lens is understanding the absolute necessity to having strong, meaningful relationships with each other and with students, and if we're talking about student achievement and student success, and that we cannot separate the relationship from the student and think that we're going to have achievement. If we want to address disproportionality, then we must first address relationships. And that means that we have to begin to take an honest look at what is happening in our districts and specifically at the site level as far as how we are positioning and valuing and supporting relationship development and for the continuation of deeper relationships. So how do we create space around this and not only have it be the focus on content or whatever that the other is, without recognizing that the relationship is actually probably one of the most important pieces to the puzzle. So speaking of puzzle, we're going to just start with a little activity. And when we think about diversity, I think about diversity by definition of all the ways in which we differ, right? And I was talking to someone, and I made the comment, someone I didn't know that I was going to meet, and I made the comment that, yeah, you'll find me, I'm the black girl with the blonde hair. And the person said, why did you have to mention you were black? And I thought, well, I live in Sonoma, so that makes it a lot easier to find me. And if I just said blonde hair, it might confuse you. But also, what's wrong with me telling you that I'm the black woman with blonde hair? Why is me telling you who I am problematic? Because it's not problematic for me. And the only reason it would be problematic for anybody else is the definition and the value that you put on what it meant when I said that I was black. But me being black by definition is not a problem. And so it reminded me how we have been so conditioned away from having these direct conversations. And if I can't tell you who I am, how are we building relationship? So what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to think about, and I'll share mine, 3 pieces of your identity, like that you make up, okay? And this is a little different, that would tell somebody who you are. So this is just a little cute puzzle that Napa put together for me. So you're not limited to what's inside this puzzle, but I want you to think of the 3 things that make up who you are. And I know there's more than 3, but what would be your top 3? So if you take a second and just make a list of your top 3 so you have them, okay? And you can't pretend you're doing this because you're going to be held accountable in the next slide. So, all right. Okay, so what I'm going to ask you to do is I'm going to ask you to get up from your table and talk to someone who you don't know in the room. So you might have to move across. And I'd like you to tell them what your name is, tell them what your position is so that we have a context, and then tell them your top 3 identities that you picked. And then tell them what was the first time you remember recalling race, okay? When was it? And tell them the little story. And we'll have about, I don't know, like 7-8 minutes to do that for each person, so about 4 minutes each person. So you get your 3 identities, let's get up, let's find someone we don't know, and your prompts are up there, and I'm gonna come down and walk around. All right, so these are mine: race, gender, and nationality. And what I realize about when we talk about identity, I realize that identity is fluid, right? It depends on where you are. It depends on what's important. So for a very long time, I would say that nationality wasn't on my list, right? And now, because of the fact that I travel abroad a lot, I am very, very conscious that I'm an American. Now, the problem with that is that I don't also quite feel like I'm American when I'm here, like by definition. And so these are things that kind of come and go depending on where you are. If I asked you to take away one of the 3 that you picked, which one would you take away? Take it away in your head. Has everyone got it? So who in your head in that quick split second refused to take something away? Yeah, a good portion of you, right? And the significance of that is that most of us can't. We have to do it. We can't refuse. And so being able to take something, to just say, I'm not going to give it up, is a luxury that many people, and especially people of color, don't have. So when our students who speak Spanish or speak a second language come to school and we say that this is an English-only zone, right? We're taking away a piece of their identity, a piece of their culture, without any thought or consequence to the impact that it might have on them. And yet, as adults who are leading these schools, we know that when it's our identity, we're not willing to take them away. Raise your hand if race was in your top 3. Okay, it's about half the room. And it's not a problem that it's not in your top 3, but let's talk about when it is in your top 3. I think about race every day. I talk about race every day. This happened long before I became an educator. I discovered race as a difference when I was in Arizona my first year of college. I was 17 years old. I grew up in West Hollywood, and I actually thought civil rights worked. It was very diverse. We didn't have any busing. I knew the difference between Chinese and Korean. I had friends who were Peruvian and Mexican. We knew the difference. We knew each other since we were in kindergarten, and we went all the way through till we graduated. When I went to Arizona, I went there a little naive in 1984, about what I would expect. I expected the community that I left. And when I got there, within, I don't know, about 3 months, well, it was 1 month after my 18th birthday, which is significant because 1 month after my 18th birthday, I got arrested. And I got arrested for getting a ride home because I was with 3 white men, because my roommate left me because she picked up somebody. I ended up spending the night in jail, and it was a Friday night. They all spent the night in jail too, but I was the only female. When we get to see the judge the next day in the morning, I'm the last one who's brought into the room. The first guy who's brought in is the driver of the car. They found that the charges were theft with intent to sell harmful drugs. We stopped at a Circle K. They wanted to pick up something on the way home. They lived across the street. They knew the woman. They were joking around with her. And they took the floor mat and they dangled it in front of her as a joke, as a prank, right? And when you live in a small town like Casa Grande, Arizona, there's nothing to do, and so you get arrested that night when you do that. So they took him in, and he pleaded guilty And he said, the people in the back seat are just getting a ride home. They know nothing about this. We took the carpet. It was a joke. They said, okay, well, you'll spend the weekend in the state penitentiary. They're no joke, right? It happens immediately. So he said, oh, no. I'm not spending the weekend in the state penitentiary. I'm changing my plea to innocent. So they let him go with his bail set at $200. So the second person they bring in there, he's from Texas, cowboy, nice guy. He says, yeah, I'm guilty, and I'll spend the weekend in jail. I did it, whatever. It was a joke, right? So he goes to the penitentiary. The third guy, who was in the backseat with me, who both of us had no idea what was going on, he says, I'm innocent. I have no idea. I'm getting a ride. I didn't do anything. I didn't even know what happened until you told me right now. So he pleads innocent, and they release him on his own recognizance. I come in there. Now, mind you, all three people before me have said that I'm innocent. And I go in and I say, I don't have any idea. I'm just getting a ride home. My girlfriend left me. They were kind enough to take me back to the campus. My bail is $274. So my bail is higher than the white man's bail who was with me, who pleaded guilty and changed his plea, right? So this is when I become very acutely aware that being black means something, and it doesn't mean something positive. So I'm going to bring it back to this exercise we just did. I think about race every day. And from that day, I thought about it every day through college and through my experiences, and everything that I went through this lens of what if my race has something to do with it. Doesn't mean that it did, but I constantly was asking this question about what if it does? What if the reason I didn't get this position is because of that? And imagine what that does to your psyche, just to always ask that question. So for those who it's not on your list, my question is not, why isn't it on your list? Because it doesn't need to be. But how do you support me when it's on my list? How do you support your teachers and your staff and your students when it's number one on their list, if it's not even on your list? How do we begin to expand ourselves enough to allow for people to show up with what they need to show up with because of how they show up in their body and how we're living our life, and be able to meet them where they are, even though it's not something that you necessarily think about? And so how do we begin to expand our list? And expanding our list is about building relationships. I'm the godmom of two white boys, blonde hair, blue eyes. And I've been with them since the day they were born. Their mom and dad and I went to college together, right? We talk about race all the time. Race was not on their family's list. It is on their list now. Because when Nicholas, who's now 20, comes home from school in elementary school and someone tells him that I can't be his Aunt Nancy because I'm black and I don't look like him, right? So how do we begin to build the relationship so that we know that while it may not be something that we're thinking about, that it's something that we must always be considerate of? And how do we expand our list so that we can be more inclusive of what people are bringing? What you'll notice is not on my list. I'm not a part of the LGBTQ community, but I have to be aware of it because it impacts people around me, because it impacts my sister, it impacts my family. And so I have to put it on my list and find a place for it, even though it's not something I personally have to think about on a daily basis, right? So the idea of understanding who we are and how we show up and how that impacts the relationships we make, who we choose to spend time with, who we choose to support, and who we believe in, who we have high expectations for. So we're going to do a little exercise to kind of show us where we are. This is an exercise that I pulled from the work of working with Pacific Educational Group, and they do this activity called Above the Line and Below the Line. And it's a really valuable activity because it lets us kind of know where we are in this work. So I want you to think about Brown versus Board of Education. Everyone knows what it is? Who can tell me what it is? Somebody. We've got a lot of educators in here. Yes, ma'am.
It was the 1954 legislation. They decided separate was not equal, and they desegregated as a result. And this launched, or was part of the civil rights movement.
Absolutely. It's exactly. What else do we know about it? It was a court case. Yeah, it was a court case. Yeah. What else do we know about it? Yes.
Argued by third impartial.
Okay, yes, definitely.
The concept was that separate is inherently unequal.
That's right. Okay, what else? What else do we know about that case and the impact?
Required schools to integrate.
It did. It required schools to integrate. And who integrated the schools? Black students, right? So we know that. I mean, even though we're not talking about it, we know that black students were taken to integrate the schools. Okay, so why wouldn't this be an ideal legislation, an ideal decision? What are some of the negative consequences that have come out of Brown versus Board of Education? Yes.
It changed the face of educators and school leaders.
Yes. It changed the face of educators and school leaders. So in 1954, there were 82,000 black teachers teaching in the United States, over 2 million black students. This is what we would call in critical race theory the counter story. When we think about the legislation and we teach it in schools, we don't teach the consequences of the legislation, of the court case, of the decision. And the reason I bring this up in this talk is if we don't understand this, we don't understand why today we don't have many black teachers. We don't understand why today there aren't many teachers of color in the field. What we say today is that the reason they're not there is because they're not interested in education, because they don't value education. If we actually taught history accurately, we would understand that up until 1954, we had plenty of black educators in this country. In 11 years immediately following Brown, more than 38,000 black teachers and administrators in 17 southern and border states lost their jobs. So that's by the time we get into the 60s. And black principals fared even worse. By some estimates, 90% lost their jobs in 11 southern states. Okay, so we have to start thinking about the impact of this. When we talk about disproportionality, when we talk about the ability to connect and cultural responsiveness and all these things, if we're not actually understanding how we're where we are and some of the kind of deep-seated resentment that we also have to heal, because I think education, we have healing to do in this work, right? It's not just about getting out of SIGDIS. It's about healing those that we have harmed through our inability to serve. And that is the relationship piece. In '64, Florida had black principals in all 67 school districts. 10 years later, with integration underway, the black school age population growing, only 40 districts had black principals. And in North Carolina, they went from 620 to 40 in that 10-year span. And in Kentucky, by '68, they had one principal. So here's a question for you to discuss at your table. What impact do you think this had on the achievement of black and brown students? And how does this contribute to the disproportionality that you see at your tables? You know, so I think it's a perfect example, because if you're doing the work to try to figure out how to diversify your work staff, and yet you don't understand why you're having a hard time recruiting people in, then you don't have enough information to actually do your work accurately, right? And so again, we're in this place of treating the the outcome, looking at the end product without treating the cause. And so until we can kind of resolve the impact of what this desegregation did to the kind of the hearts and minds of the children that were involved and the families that were involved, why would people go back into education? You know what I mean? So we have to resolve this. And this is the healing part that I'm talking about. When you think about it, raise your hand if you have children in the room. Actually, your own biological, or not biological, excuse me, just children, your children. Yeah. All right. So I want you to imagine what you would feel like today if you had to actually send your kid to a school where you knew that they weren't valued, where you knew that they weren't wanted, and it wasn't 100%, right? But there's enough, or where you knew that they were loved, but it's that kind of love you to death syndrome. Like, I love you and I feel sorry for you, but I really am not going to hold you to any really high expectation. I'm just really glad you're here. Right? And how that lends itself to the behaviors that we see, how that lends itself to the performance that our students of color are putting out there because they are not connected. And so, where are we going? Where are we looking for the excellence? And in understanding this, we begin to know that if we want to find folks, if we really want to truly diversify, then we have to go to where they have Black teachers, right? So who knows about the HBCUs? Some of us. Who doesn't know what an HBCU is? The historical Black, colleges and universities. And I want to say, we want to think ideally and say this is unintended consequence, but I'm not sure that I can say that. When you look at the legislation, one of the things that was crucial to understand about the Brown versus Board was that the reason the families went into this class action lawsuit was not because they felt that the education they were receiving in their schools was inadequate. They felt that their kids were getting excellent educations from excellent teachers. What they wanted was for the future. They wanted to have access. They wanted to be able to move freely. And so they felt like this is something they could do. But if you actually read the words inside the legislation, you begin to find out that the reason that they voted to pass the law was because they defended that the Black schools were insufficient. That that Black kids were at a detriment to participate in Black schools, and that was the rationale for why they had to pass this law. And that then begins to help you understand why when we talk about integration and desegregation, why it went one way. Because if you think the institution of Black education is not sufficient to educate Black children, why would you put white children in it? And if you think the teachers who are teaching the Black children are not effective enough to teach Black children, they're definitely not going to be allowed to teach white children. So you see this one-way integration and desegregation. But again, it's that thing of what I've asked you before. If I have to send my kid to a school where they are not respected, where they are not loved, where they are not pushed, how do they achieve? Okay, and so when we bring it back, thank you, when we bring it back to disproportionality and we bring it fast forward to today, we begin to really understand the kind of creation of this. And it didn't just start with Brown versus Board of Education, but it's a significant enough decision that really set the trajectory of where we see our kids now and where we see our schools now. And so how do we begin to bring back those components that actually allowed Black and Brown students to be successful in their education plan even when it was not equal? And I do have a hypothesis that I have yet to pursue, but I sincerely believe that the literacy rate for Black students, for those who were able to go to school, is probably higher when the schools were segregated than it is now. And I've been looking for probably a solid year for information to either support or dispute that belief, that hypothesis. And what I found was more insidiousness of how we actually just don't want that information to be known and how we stopped collecting information after we integrated schools. And so I may never know what the true literacy rate was, but what I do know is a difference between being educated in a system that has high expectations for you, that loves you, that pushes you, as opposed to being educated in a system where you feel like you don't belong. You feel like you're a visitor and that you don't actually belong there. So questions to consider is, why don't you know this? Why isn't this a part of the history that you're taught? How does not knowing this harm you, harm me? How does not knowing this harm others? Who benefits from the teachings of a whitewashed history? And how do our gaps of knowledge interfere with our ability to form authentic relationships with people who are different from us? And so if I could ask you anything, is to think about this slide and take these questions back with you to your sites. And ask your teams to start asking these questions. Because until we get to the root cause, when we talk about significant disproportionality, without really understanding how we get there in the first place, you're all doing good work. You're all working super hard. And yet, I'm not sure that we can actually resolve it completely without getting to fixing the root cause of it. What questions do you have? We're all good? Just kind of soaking, taking it in? Okay. So I know you've seen this before, but this takes us on our journey here, because what I like that's different about this is that I found this one that said justice. So you've seen the fence, you've seen the kid, the ball field, and we know the difference between equality and the difference between equity. And then I think the third one said before, no barriers, right? But what I appreciate about this idea here about it being justice is that we are actually now starting to look at what are the root causes so that we can eliminate the conditions that have put us in this position. And what would that look like to understand what got us here? So each site is going to be different. Each district, we all have a shared history, but each of us has gotten there a different way. So really understanding what those barriers are and really trying to mitigate those barriers. And like I said, again, part of that is about healing. How do we heal the wounds? How do we build trust? I heard trust about 3 times today in the presentation I did about, we're doing this work, but people really don't trust each other. So how do you do this work if there's no trust? How do you make yourself vulnerable if you're not sure that what you share is not going to be used against you? And how do we make sure that the people who are being positioned to be vulnerable in this work aren't always only the people of color? How do we make sure that all of us are sharing the responsibility? Because in fact, what I know for sure is that it's going to be my white allies who are going to be able to be heard differently than I can in certain areas that I'm working in. And while I can give a message, it's always relegated to, well, we don't have that many black students. Why are we talking about black students? Right? Or this black person, she's talking about this, and yeah, we get it, but this is her issue. And until it becomes our issue, and until we have everyone, and that means our white allies standing up in front and doing this talk, right? And speaking in front of everyone. We saw a wonderful thing come out of Eastside Union in a presentation that John just did. Where the board president, the superintendent, the assistant superintendent, and the director all spoke to their equity imperative for the year, and how powerful that is to show that your leadership is behind it, and that they mean it, and that they're living it, and that they're living it with you. It's not something I'm having you do for me, right? It's something that we're all living. So we need to think about that. So we're going to go into a little bit of data just to show the impact of relationships. And this comes out of Lisa Delpit's book, Multiplication is for White People. She says, over time, we have lost 2 major components: the high expectations with rigor and social supports, both of which allow students of color to achieve academically. And this is where we really have to start thinking. I know there's a lot of talk, and I think people are kind of sick of talking about culturally relevant, right, and cultural competency. And I guess I'm kind of tired of talking about it too. I would just like us to do it, right? I like us to live it and just have it be done. But this idea, when we talk about being culturally competent, and the Lindsays do really great work on their cultural proficiency timeline, is that by us becoming more culturally competent, we understand that each of our students require things differently in order to achieve, instead of providing it one way. And we know that intellectually, but I'm not sure that we do it in practice. So what she defines as both of these combined are warm demanders. And she says that warm demanders is academic press, which is where you have like strong, rigorous content, but the expectations are clear. Students know what achievement looks like for you, and they're provided the supports they need. I listened to, I don't know why I'm blanking. She wrote Cultural Proficiency and the Blaine Zarenda Hammond and the Brain. And she said that she saw this teacher teach a lesson, and it was a math lesson. And a lot of students failed this one problem. They couldn't get it right. And she said that the teacher, instead of marking it wrong, she went to what they called the math clinic. And the math clinic or math hospital was where everyone brought their chairs around, and they had the paper, and they put up the problem, and they operated on this problem as a class. Right? They got to figure out what went wrong, what went right, what did we do here? And they talked about it. So failure was actually and should be considered an opportunity to learn and to grow, as opposed to failure being something that we punish and we don't give another opportunity. So what does it look like if we all get to go to that math clinic? What does it look like that when we fail, that we actually are encouraged to try again? Where we're actually encouraged to learn so that we can do it better the next time, as opposed to being punished for not getting it right. And then what you end up with is a generation of kids, which I think we have right now, who are afraid to make mistakes. They're afraid to take risk because they don't want to get it wrong, because their history is when they get it wrong, then I'm punished. So we need to kind of create like a math hospital. We need to do that for everything. There's got to be a hospital for everything where we can go and learn how to do it differently. But that means that we have to take the time that it takes to make that happen. And that comes into the social supports. The social supports call for us to actually build relationships in and outside of school with our students. And I know when you get into the high school level, middle school, you're like, well, that's not possible. I teach 150 students a day. But what I can tell you is it's not, 150 students don't need you to have that deep relationship with them in and out of school. There's probably a dozen of them that actually require your attention. The problem is that dozen are also the same dozen that make you sick. Right? They're the ones who drive you crazy. They're the ones that some of us are trying to figure out how we can get them into alt-ed. But what if we shifted that attention and not just gave it to the ones that make us proud, like Mia for me, but the ones who actually challenge us the most? The ones who we're not actually really sure, but we know that there's a strong desire to, and we hope like heck that we can do something to change their circumstances. This is what it looks like in data. Schools, this is reading, and my pointer, I guess it doesn't work on this, so I'll just talk you through it. So the low academic press schools are to the far left, closest to the vertical bar there. They're the low academic press schools, and the blue is low social supports. So you see schools that basically do not have high rigor, and also do not have high social supports. You have your students who are not even achieving 1 year at their grade level. The same school that has the low rigor but has the high social supports are actually still having students achieve at grade level. Think about that. So think about that and what that means to where we're putting our energy. So you can actually not have a high rigorous school, but if you have high relationships, you can still get them through their grade. And then of course the ideal situation is the far left column, or far right, pardon me, where you have the school that has the rigor, but also has the high social supports, and they're almost at 2 years of growth. The same is true for math. And math has typically been the gatekeeper for kids of color and has been the gatekeeper for kids of color for A through G. Okay? When we have schools with low academic press but high social supports, they're still going to pass. They're still going to do what they need to. And if we could figure out how to have stronger relationships, they're going to excel and be ahead of the game by the end of the year. And so what would it look like for us to actually begin to become warm demanders for our kids? To provide the warm demanders so that they, regardless of where they are, where they start off, that we know that with our content and with our relationships, with our social supports, that we can actually get them to where they need to be. And so when we think about just disproportionality in general, think about understanding this and implementing this and what changes you would see in your districts. Across the board, not just in your special education. So becoming a warm demander means that we have to intentionally build relationships. It has to be an intentional endeavor. We can't just assume that if we click that, okay, we're in relationship now. We have to actually actively build them. We have to learn about our students' cultures, and this goes back to the being culturally responsive. We have to communicate an expectation of success that we and mean it, not just say, like all means all, and I love that. And, that's a great phrase, but are we living it? That's, my question is always when I look at mission statements, and we'll talk about that, like great mission statement. I've seen some amazing mission statements. Does the data support your mission, right? Move beyond believing to insisting. I can believe in all my kids, I can have all the right words, but if I insist that you succeed, it looks different in my instruction. It looks different in how I'm interacting with you. So what does it look like for you to insist that your kids are successful? Support positive behavior and be clear and consistent with expectations. So at your table, I'd like you to, just with a partner, just pair share because it'll go faster. I want you to recall an effective teacher that you had. What made that teacher effective for you? And just tell a story, briefly. What made that teacher effective for you? So I just want you to shout out, what were some of those characteristics? What made that teacher effective for you? And just shout it out so everyone can hear you. Listen to you. Accepting, they cared about you. High expectations. Made me feel good. Never gave up. Interesting. They liked what they were doing. Engaging. Pardon? Like a mother. Fun. Challenged you. Yeah. Okay, so same thing, but this time you don't have to talk about it because I don't think you have to think that hard about it. I want you to think of your least effective teacher. Everyone, like you got it? Okay, so shout out, what were the characteristics that made that teacher the least effective teacher for you? Dittos. Cold. More dittos. They were mean, critical, lazy, sat at their desk, shame people, my way or the highway. Always made their conversation about themselves. Low expectations. Mine, he threw erasers. Right? So what do you notice about the adjectives used on both for your favorite and your least favorite? It's all about relationships. We had a couple who said high expectations, low expectations, engaging. But outside of those, the things that make us remember, the things that we hold on to, the things that get us through are actually the relationships that we made. They made us feel a certain way. If they made us feel good and special and supported, then they became our favorite. And if they made us feel like crap, they became our worst. And we told everybody, don't take that teacher. I actually went to Europe to not take my international relations class with a teacher because he was the only one who taught it in our San Diego campus. And he prided himself that 3/4 of the class would not pass. He prided himself in that. So I decided I already know I'm in the 3/4, so I'm going somewhere else to take this class. Right? So when we spend our energy, and what's important about that, when we spend our energy looking at all the content pieces, we have to remember that the things that even us as adults doing this work that were most impactful to us were the way they made us feel. And so my question is always, I want someone in this room, can you name every teacher you had K-12? Who can do it? K-12. Seriously? Really? Both of you can? I got something for you after this. Talk to me. I want your card. Because the majority of us cannot. And why not? Why not? So they weren't mean to us. They didn't make us feel horrible about ourselves, but we just don't remember them. And so my question is always, who are you? Are you the one that your students remember? Are you the one because you were a great teacher and you made them feel good? Are you the one they remember because you made them feel horrible? Or are you the one that they just don't remember? And I think that's really, and that's not even a judgment. I know who I want to be, right? I know who I strive to be. And I know very real terms that I've been all three of them in the course of my 25, 30 years of teaching. But I know who I choose to be. And so when we think about what we're investing in and how we're going about this, we have to balance the technical with the adaptive. It's easy to get into these technical solutions, and we have to do the technical pieces, so don't get me wrong. But we also have to do the adaptive pieces, which actually build and support the changing of the climates that created the circumstances of which you're now finding yourself in. And if we only spend energy on addressing the technical pieces and the technical fixes, we're actually not going to see any real significant change. And if we do, it's not going to last. The way it lasts is by actually changing the climate in which it was created in. So I know you've heard, and we talk about social emotional learning, and I'm just going to keep talking about it because I think that when we start thinking about it's not just training teachers on strategies, which I'll give you some strategies too, but it's also how do we teach our teachers to love our kids? And what kinds of experiences can we begin to create that authentically foster that to happen? So I work with an elementary school in Novato. And one of the things that they did last year was they did a scavenger hunt in the community. And the students were the ones who were leading the parents and the teachers on the scavenger hunt. Because the teachers, the majority of them, don't live in the community. And so they wanted the parents and the teachers to bond and understand what was happening in the community, so they did a scavenger hunt. That's an authentic way to build relationships. It's also an interesting way to shift power dynamics. So you're now empowering people, and you're allowing them to show you who they are, to show you what they value, to show you what's important to them. And you begin to deepen your understanding of maybe why they show up a certain way, or maybe why they do something, or maybe why they believe something. And in this expansion, we have a lot more room for allowance and tolerance. right? So when we think about this, when we talk about SEL, I'm trying to figure out where I'm looking here. We know that it not only benefits the student's emotional health, but it actually, as we saw on those slides, have an academic impact. So how do we focus our work also with our staff on how to build these relationships? And the beauty about this, as it says in the second paragraph, is that we really don't need to do things different. What we need to do is be explicit about it. A lot of this is just good teaching, but we're not explicit. We're just like, this is what I do. But what does it look like to explicitly acknowledge that we have to be intentional about building relationships with all kids? And what does it look like for me to actually walk through and say, I've got my target kid for the year. This is the kid. He drives me crazy. And it's he for me, not being gender thing. I just taught boys. I teach boys. So it's always he. How do I figure out my target kid? The one who drives me the most crazy is the one that I'm going to give the most love to. I'm going to love him, and I'm going to push him, and he's going to push me, and I'm going to push him, and we're going to time out, right? But how do we get intentional and explicit about developing those relationships? Some of the strategies, the first one, and always the first one for me, is this idea about self-awareness. I don't know that we do enough work around developing our own self-awareness of understanding who we are and how who we are and how we show up impacts what happens. We spend a lot of energy in education looking at the other. We're trying to fix a problem. We're trying to, this group of kids, it's our SPED kids, it's our Black kids, it's our brown kids, it's our Spanish speakers, it's our, we have all these groups. And at no real point do we intentionally look at how does who I am and what I believe in, how does that show up and possibly impact the outcomes that we're seeing? And so where are we creating this space for us to reflect, to be vulnerable, to make mistakes, and to grow? Self-management. How do we empower students to take responsibility for their own actions? And I don't mean just behaviorally, I mean also their success. How do we empower them to know that it's in their control, right? Instead of us being the point person that they always have to check into. Social awareness, modeling kindness and enhancing relationship skills, and then responsible decision-making, utilizing collaborative learning strategies to enhance social awareness. And it's not only collaborative learning strategies for the kids, but it's also for us. I heard today, and I continually hear this, I heard it in my brown bag too, and we're talking about the lack, we have this departmentalization, right? Everything is split up, except for that's not how life works. And would it make more sense if we actually did more integrated strategies? I know that when I'm co-teaching and when I was team teaching with my colleague, that our work was better. Like together, our collaboration created better content for our students, better activities for them to engage in than what I could create on my own. And so right now we do a lot of department planning, and I know there's some teams that do vertical planning, but what does it look like to really to plan between the content areas? And to actually model what collaboration looks like. And I think part of why we don't do it is because we don't really want to do it. Because a lot of us don't actually want to have to compromise what we've always done to work with someone else, to do it differently. But if we can't do it, how do we expect them to do it? So, who do you say you are? And what does the data say you are? What does the data tell you? And so this is also my second invitation to you, is to think about your mission statement, your value statement, and think about what you're saying to the public, what you're saying to your client, who are your students and your families. And then look at your data and say that these things match up. And if they don't match up, it's not about punishing yourself, it's about understanding that we need to do something different. And where are the holes? Because if we say all means all, then your data should say all means all. And if it doesn't, how do we get it there? Right? We need to look at the policies and procedures that exist. And I know that this would never happen here, but I started this school year with one of the first articles I read being of a young black girl. She's in kindergarten, going to her first day of school, and some of you might have read this, in Florida, and being sent home because she had braids in her hair. And when the parent asked about why that was a problem, the school said that over the summer, they changed their policy around extensions. And so my question is, who wears extensions typically? So this 6-year-old, on her, what should have been an amazing experience for her on her first day to school, is sent home and is told that she cannot come back until they take her hair out, which the family paid probably some good money to get it in. So that's an extreme, but I share it because we want to think that this stuff is ancient history, and this is September, right? And thank God it wasn't California, but it could be California. So looking at your policies and procedures and actually doing regular review of them so that you can get a deeper, and putting the lens of critical race theory over it so that you begin to ask questions about, does this really promote who we say we are, right? Your staff demographics, your student demographics, looking at those. Again, not punishing, but most of you may now understand why you're 63% white teachers, right? So if we want to change that, what do we do? And again, it's not that white teachers can't teach students of color, but we know that we need to have multiple perspectives, right? So whose voice is in the room, right? And how do decisions get made? How do we make sure that we're creating an inclusive environment? So we're going to walk through, the third piece is how effective is your communication? And so we're going to go through a little activity where we're going to get to practice actually walking through what we call the protocol. John talks about it. We work together to recognize it, interrupt it, and repair it, and it's called compassionate dialogue. And the idea is that it works on 3 levels. It works, and what we're going to work on today is that interpersonal, but it also works intrapersonal. But more importantly, and what I'm going to ask you with the papers that are on your table at the end of this, is it works organizationally. And if you can understand the protocol on a personal level, you can also apply it to your organization to start to walk it through so that you can begin to change what's happening at your site level or at your district level. So these are the cards we're going to work with. You're going to be able to choose from these 4. And the idea is, how do you interrupt this if you hear it? It's not said to you, but you overhear it in your workplace. So we're making it personal. I'm not saying that you've overheard this on the street. I'm saying that in your workspace, you've heard someone say this, that's gay, or this, you're good for giving directions for a woman, or this, I bet 80% of my kids will end up pregnant or in jail before they finish high school, or this, what are they cooking or eating over there? The smell is atrocious. Can't you just have a sandwich like everybody else? Now, what is most disturbing about all these, all of them really, is that these are all things that were submitted to me that people have overheard that they wish they would have interrupted. So these aren't things I've made up that I don't sit in a room and try to make up all the microaggressions that I can think of. And I don't have to, because there's enough out there and people submit them. So what I'm going to ask you to do is to find a partner, and I'd like you to pick one of the cards. So get your partner and together agree on the card that you want to walk through. And I'm going to walk us through practicing the protocol. And then we're going to do it a second time, and you have the instructions in front of you, but the first time I want to walk you through so that you understand it. So is there anyone who's in need of a partner before it gets too loud in here for me to do anything? Everyone got a partner? Okay. So does everyone and your partner, do you have a card? Have you identified your card? Because I'm going to leave the slide. So Have you identified the card you're going to talk about? Just one card. So if you've picked one card, raise your hand so I know. Raise your hand if you got a card picked. All right, just one card. All right. So this is what we're going to do. The first step of the protocol is recognize it. And what this is asking you to do, and you have it there, is to think about, one, does the card even have a trigger for you? And if it does, what is the feeling that comes up for you? And in education, we are really, really focused on fixing things. We want to fix it. And so right now I'm going to ask you to feel it. I just want you to check in with your feeling. Don't do anything else. Just feel it. So when I come back around in about 30 seconds, you should be able to tell me your feeling word that came up when you decided on that card. So with your partner, share your feeling word and why you have that feeling about the statement. And I know that went quick but feelings, you knew your feeling immediately. So shout out what feelings came up for you. Anger, annoyed, sad. Ignorance is not a feeling though. So I want us to, and this is why I do that, because ignorance is a judgment. It's not personal, right? So I need a feeling. So what is the feeling underneath the ignorance?
Yeah, I guess sadness.
Sadness for you? Okay. No. You can't be sad for the person, right? It's what it's, and this is why we slow this one down, because we always, our minds, and this is not, our minds are always out there. We're always trying to fix it. And what we have to really truly understand is that each of us brings something to the table. So if you trigger anger in me, you're going to get a very different response than if you trigger sadness in me, or if you trigger shock in me. And I have to be acutely aware of when it's anger, because then I need to just shut up, right? My friend says, ride your emotional wave before you open your mouth. Because I know, I always say, and this doesn't mean anything to many people, but those of you who it does, I'm a Sagittarian and I'm a fire horse. And that's all bad when it comes to what comes out of my mouth. Right? I speak truth, but it's sometimes just like sharp as an arrow. So I have to work really hard on not shooting my arrow and really just trying to have a compassionate dialogue. And so we have to first get in touch with the feeling it triggers in us so that we can mitigate what our response would be if we didn't take care of it. Discuss. There you go. Okay. And we're with it. So you see the shift, right? The difference between ignorance and sad for the person and disgust. So if I'm coming from a place of disgust, how does that change how I engage with the person who said it? Right? Does that mean if I'm disgusted or it triggers something in me, does that mean I over-discipline this child? Right? This is why we have to know what it brings up for us. So thank you for being a perfect example so that we can get to, because you're not alone. All right, so the second piece of the protocol calls for us to interrupt it. So the idea is that we cannot let this go by without saying something or stopping it. And sometimes we don't always feel comfortable to do that. And so part of why we don't feel comfortable is because we don't practice. Because this is a conversation that we've actually been trained not to have. So someone says that's gay, and we're just kind of, and we walk off, and we just think you're an idiot, right? Or you're ignorant, or whatever word. But that means that person has permission to continue to say it. So if you were to interrupt whichever card you chose, what would you say to that person to get them to talk? And so we talk about inquiry. It's about asking questions. So if you start off with, you know what, that was a really stupid thing to say, you've pretty much stopped the conversation. But if you start off and say, you know what, I actually don't share that view. Can you tell me more? I'm curious what you mean by that. Then you put the responsibility on the person to have to explain themselves, right? Now that takes work, because we like to tell people what is wrong with them. We don't actually like to listen to people who share different perspectives than us. And I'm equally guilty. It takes a lot for me to hear what I don't want to hear. But I know that if I want to actually have effective communication, that I have to do this. So what I'm going to ask you to do with your partner, and you get a little bit longer time frame now, is what for you would feel authentic to interrupt that statement? What would you be willing to say to the person you overheard in your office or in your classroom? What would you be willing to say to them to engage them in the conversation, to interrupt that so that they know by your simple question that what they said was not okay? Practice with each other. And you've got some prompts on that paper in the center of your table. And if anyone needs more, we have some on the other tables. So what were some of the interruptions that you tried? Yep, questioning the meaning. Yeah. And what was it like to interrupt? Like, what did you feel trying to interrupt? Is it something that you think you would do? Yes? Every time? Not sure? So what would be the times you wouldn't do it? Let's talk about those. What would be a situation where you would not interrupt what you just practiced interrupting? The boss? Okay, so the power structure, your boss? Okay, what's another situation? Yes, okay. So then when we talk about safety, right, we're talking literally about physical safety, right? Yep. He said if it was their last day before retirement. Yeah, you're like, why even bother, right? Okay. Yes. Yeah, the whole racial fatigue piece, right? You're just tired. And then we get used to not doing it. So we each have to figure out how we get over those things. Because if we have a boss, and I get it, and I know that what I'm going to say may sound like that's absolutely ridiculous, but I'm going to say it anyway. When you're in a power dynamic where you can't speak your truth, it's good. So I'm trying to figure out how to say this because I know. But you know, because I can preach, but what I feel like is I have to share this perspective though, because my belief is that I can't do my job if I can't tell you what's going on, right? And I can't share with you, and if we can't have a dialogue. And yet I know that it's a very real fear that you could, you know, lose your job or just be harassed on the job. And so I don't want to minimize that is a real possibility. But I also know that someone asked me today, what is the biggest barrier to the effectiveness of this work? And I think that's one of them, is this fear about worrying about our position and not really taking into account the impact of our silence. So for better or for worse, I've made decisions in my life so I don't ever have to do that. So I never got married, and I never had children. And once it clicked on me, and it clicked literally in a room like this, where someone asked me why I didn't have kids, and I thought about it because I never thought about it because I didn't want to think about it. And I thought about it, and it was twofold. One was I was afraid of having black boys because my family were boy producers. Out of 16 kids from my siblings, 14 are boys. And so I was afraid because I didn't feel like I could protect them. And the second piece of it was that I didn't want to ever be a hostage to a job, because if I had a family, then I would feel like I could not walk away so easily because I'm taking care of that family. So I've made decisions in my life that allow me to do this work very effectively, but that have personally taken a toll on me. And so we each need to figure out how far and how hard we're going to push, and how much we're willing to sacrifice. Because in this room, I already know that for the most part, I'm preaching to the choir. But all of you have to go out there and work with people who will explicitly get in your way, who will explicitly try to stop the work that you're doing. And how do you continue to do it? And how do you step up in those dynamics and know that you have to do it? Right? And I don't know how to make that happen. It makes me very emotional to think about it. I don't know how we get to where you want to get out of SIG-DIS without taking some of those risks and without being willing to sacrifice something. Our kids are sacrificing every day, and so we have to figure it out. Okay, so the third part of the protocol is repair it. So I always say that the repair it, it doesn't really happen unless you live in the same house, because you can only sleep in separate bedrooms for so long, and so you have to figure it out. In schools, we can just avoid each other, and we do that. We've all done it. We've had an interaction, and we've avoided. We see the person the next day, we avoid them. We used to say hello. We used to grab a cup of coffee. Now we see each other and we turn around, right? But that's part of the problem, because we can't get any good work done if we can't work with ourselves. And so the repair it says that when you interrupt, how do you come back a day later, a week later, and actually try to heal the relationship and deepen it? So if I interrupt you, and we have a conversation, you explain, you still might feel awkward. We may feel okay in the moment, but the more time goes by, the more awkward we begin to feel. And so when you see me tomorrow, you may not be that excited to see me. And so the responsibility then comes to me that I know you heard me, you listened, so I've got to come back to you and check in with you, right? And so the repair it can take the form, and again, you have it there. Primarily, it takes a form of engagement. Primarily, it would just be me going back up to him and just saying, a day later or the next time I saw him, you know what, thank you so much for hearing me. I really appreciate that. I know it was a hard conversation, but I really feel like we've deepened, whatever that dialogue is. But the idea is that you begin to understand that, one, we're okay, and two, that conflict can happen and we survive. Like, it is not the end of the world. And at this moment, I want to push for a second on this notion of safety, because this has come up a lot. And I just was told the other day about a participant said, I feel unsafe. And I stopped the entire presentation and I asked her, I said, can you tell me what that feels like? When you say you feel unsafe, and it wasn't me personally, it was about what we were talking about, and she just felt, and she says, I feel unsafe. And I said, tell me what that means to you. And she couldn't tell me what the feelings were. She's like, I just don't feel, I said, so tell me what safety feels like for you then. Because maybe we would define that. And she's like, safety for me is comfortable. I said, so is unsafe uncomfortable? And she said, well, yeah, I think it is. And I said, well, that's interesting, because when you say unsafe and you say it in the context of you're talking to someone and you're like, he or she made me feel unsafe, the first thing I think about is that you're in physical danger or emotional danger, but some kind of danger. I don't think discomfort is danger. But because we have become to equate discomfort with safety, we derail the entire conversation. So the minute you have participants in the room who feel unsafe, we have to stop talking about it. And so what we have to do through the protocol is actually make a differentiation between safety and discomfort, and then create spaces on a regular basis where people can learn to experience discomfort and get used to it, so that they know that this is actually, discomfort is how change happens. Discomfort is how you get out of SIG-DIS. Discomfort, it is. It's not easy, right? And discomfort is how we impact change for our kids. And you normalize discomfort. You can't normalize something you won't practice, right? And so we have to start calling these things out and paying close attention to the language that we use. We also see how the language of safety puts in jeopardy the lives of our Black men. when people feel unsafe around a black man. And so language is super important. So the repair. What I'd like you to do with your partner again is I'd like you to go back to your same scenario. You talked about how you interrupted it, and now I want you to talk about what would you say to the person a day later or a week later. Primarily, it's about engagement, but it can also be about education. I've had people, when I've walked out of the sessions, who are like, I really didn't get it, I don't really disagree with you. And so sometimes for me, it's about reading, it's about educating. It's about providing, you know what, maybe I didn't say it, I'm kind of tired, I don't feel really well, maybe I didn't say it great, I'm gonna send you an article that you can read, right? Sometimes it's about actually observing and participating in something. An example would be the Museum of Tolerance. Why do we take people to the Museum of Tolerance? Because we want them to have an experience, right? Why do we have the lynching museum? Because we want them to have an experience. We want people to know, we want people to feel. And so when people are having a hard time connecting to what you're trying to do, how do you make them feel? How do you help them connect? Right? So like what I'd like you to do then is go back to your partner. What would you do to repair your interruption? What would you say or do or explain or share the next time you saw that person? So a couple minutes with your partner. So on your table, you have a piece of paper. And what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to take that paper and I'd like you to flip it on the back side. And you'll see that there is a worksheet. Okay? And what I'd like you to do, what I just put up there are the 3 ways that you can use the protocol. And it's always great to practice on the interpersonal because we're just kind of building our capacity to engage. But it's also, what I'm going to invite you to do is to think about organizationally, what is your number one issue? You have 4 lines on that version. On the first line, I'd like you to think of, so that you get to practice, because this is your kind of call to action. I'd like you to think of a personal or intrapersonal issue that needs your attention. Someone that you need to make amends with, someone you've been avoiding, someone that you got some unfinished stuff with. Write down the person's name, write down the event, and just make a commitment to say that I am going to the next time, and then we'll talk about the interrupted. The second piece is, and this is a bigger, because when we talk about the intra and the inter, it's a very personal thing. When we talk about the organizational, when you identify what your issue is, it's not for you to do by yourself. In fact, you will not accomplish it probably most likely alone, right? But when you think about the organizational, and I've just given some examples up there, you want to think about interruption. It's like, who's your team? Like, who can support you and where can you start? So you start to plan. It's actually like by design. Instead of just kind of going at it, if we're going to attack this, who needs to be in the room? Whose voice is missing? If you've already started the work, what's missing? What's not working? And so you you identify that, and then the repair is the plan, and we'll talk about that as we get to the next slide. But I want you to identify something that has got your passion, and I'd like you to write it down. And then I would say that you start with the personal interruption because the personal is the one that allows you just to practice. Right? Just practice. What is it like if we engage in these kinds of conversations every day? Would you feel more comfortable if you had to do this every single day? If every day you and I drew a card and we just role played, like in the end of 2 weeks, would we feel more confident and comfortable doing it, right? It could be as simple as practicing like that, right? And so making a commitment, and I always think writing it down makes a difference, right? And then how do we continue to improve? And this is how you follow that cycle. So this whole cycle of inquiry, I always look at, there was someone talking about, we did this training, the teachers. So I got the teachers and the principals and the superintendent to lead their staff development, and it was huge. It was awesome. But the feedback for the first time they led, the feedback actually was great, but there's, who do we pay attention to? We pay attention to the couple that are not so great, right? That like it's not as polished, and so they're feeling vulnerable because they put themselves out there. Because I said, as their coach, I'm like, well, I'm not doing the keynote all day. We're going to do this together. So we created teams. I had the superintendent and his colleague doing data. I was doing microaggressions. Someone else was doing conversation starters, and of course we focus in on the negative comments, right? And so they are afraid to do it again. And I'm like, this is what we have to do again. The only way that you get good at this is by practicing. And so our tendency when we enter this cycle is that we're good at the identifying, we're good at, looking at designing something. But then when we do the implementation, if it doesn't work the first time, we throw it out. But what does it look like to actually say, to really evaluate the implementation and say, okay, well, this worked, but this didn't. And you begin the tweak and you do this cycle. And so with that brings back in that math hospital analogy. If our expectation is that the first time we implement that it actually will not work, 100%. You see how you change the mind shift? If you actually know that it probably will not work the first time and that you're going to have to tweak it, you go into it expecting that you're going to have to do this many times before you get it right. When you do something and you think the first time you do it is supposed to change your circumstances, then you're always going to be set up for failure because it just doesn't work that way. Most of you are large districts. The things that you're doing are going to take time, and then you're going to have to figure it out on the site level. Right? So how do we get to this cycle of inquiry, and how do we use the protocol to kind of push back? And if you actually had a structure that was accepted, Roma Land, before Julie Vitale left and went down to San Diego, she did the conversations with her board. They did it across the district because she wanted to be able to have a dialogue, and she wanted people to have a structure in which they felt like they could actually push back and push the work forward. So what does it look like to create a climate where it is expected that this happens, right? Some of the strategies that you can do district-wide is just ensure that you have professional learning opportunities. I always talk about incentivizing, and I want to be clear because I needed to make the distinction, and it was super important. They're like, I have a problem with incentivizing teachers. They just should do it. And I said, yeah, you know what? Teachers do just do it. And the difference in incentivizing is we're incentivizing people, where I want to get to is that we're incentivizing people to do the work that they would already do. We're letting them know that we appreciate what they do, as opposed to incentivizing to try to get someone to do the work. And you see the difference in that? And so how do we support those people who are already doing it and encouraging people to do it? And I believe in incentivizing, but I think the mistake is when we think that it's a way that we're going to make people do the work, because when they're only doing it for an increase in pay and they're only doing it for whatever, then they're not really necessarily bought into doing it. So, but how do we create opportunities? Because teachers are working long hours. How do we incentivize them and emphasize the necessity of building and maintaining relationships with all of their kids? How do we create opportunities to build meaningful relationships, not just with students, but also with colleagues and with the families? How do we take it outside of there? And then finally, one of the things that I think is underutilized is mentoring. We do a lot of academic mentoring. We don't really do, and when we identify kids for mentoring around issues, it's always around something that they need support with. But every kid could use a mentor. So what kind of programs can we begin to implement that actually support the responsibility and the relationships between students and between staff? And what could that look like? Food for thought. You've seen this before, but I always like to come back at one change that was made that is important to me, and they're the same, but love, right? When you look at Maslow, it's usually belonging, and I think belonging is super important as well. But love is a part of that belonging. If I feel loved, then I feel like I belong. And how do we bring that dialogue back into schools? How do we talk about love and talking about what as the motivating factor as to why we do what we do? Understanding that it's through our love that they're going to actually actualize, right? So every role counts in your district. We underutilize our classified, who are typically your people of color. And we need to figure out how to bring every voice into the space so that it becomes a climate where we feel like all of our voices matter. So I'm going to wind down with just a personal narrative to share with you a little bit about my experience and why this means so much to me. I grew up in West Hollywood, as I shared, and that was flippers. I don't know, any West Hollywood, LA people in the house? Anyone know this? You might be a little young. I'm a little old, one or the other. It was the first roller disco, and so you could roller skate and drink at the same time. That's a dangerous combination. In fact, one of our claims to fame is that Prince, before he was Prince, played there while people roller skated around him. So I was, and my sister, we were skate guards there. Skate guards. We guarded the skates. Carol. No, I'm joking. We roller skated around and we made sure everybody was safe, and when they were hanging over with drinks, we did that. So the thing that's important to understand, though, is that when I started working, I was 12. And I started working at 12 because my mom left, and so there was 5 of us. We had 3 older brothers. They were 19, 18, 17, and then my sister and I were 11 when she left. But my grandmother was there, but my grandmother had a stroke, so at 12, we had a family meeting, and they said, you have to go to work. And so there was other rules about that. The other rules talked about the fact that we couldn't actually get in trouble, because if we got in trouble, then CPS would get involved and we would be taken out of the home. So our saving grace, I'm an identical twin in case you didn't know. My saving grace and our saving grace was that we were probably about the same size today that we were when we were 12 years old. And so I was a liar early on. I lied about my age. I lied about almost everything. And that's another story, but I lied for a long time, far beyond when it served me, because it becomes a habit, right? So that's another conversation for another day. So this is my sister and I up in the booth, the music booth. And so these are my friends. I grew up in a very diverse neighborhood. We were young. We had the house that was the party house because there was no adult in the house. We were drinking really good beer then too. No insult to Michelob, but I'm glad microbreweries exist today. And we were good kids, but I think that we were really, we could have gone either way. We were good kids, but we didn't have any rules. We didn't have any curfews. We experimented with drugs. We did things because we would work until 2 o'clock in the morning, and then we would have to get up and go to school because we could not be at school, so we didn't want to get in trouble. But the problem is when you work until 2 in the morning, and then you get up to go to school at 8 o'clock, you're tired, and so you start sleeping in class and you start doing things. So this was middle school. This is Mr. Flynn, Dennis Flynn. He was my sister and I, he was our middle school PE teacher. And he was one of the first people to identify very early on with my sister and I that there was something going on that shouldn't be going on in the house. But he also was the first one to actually decide to build a relationship with us. And so when I would fall asleep, he would actually give us a cot in the back of the gym to sleep in, and then have us go back to class. And basically, it was the village of my middle school that got us through middle school. Greg Miata was my math teacher. I still don't like math, but I love him. And he was another person in the puzzle who just, if we had a dentist appointment, paid for us to see a dentist because we didn't have insurance, would drive us home when we didn't have bus passes because we couldn't afford to do it. Lois Keithley, she was our counselor. And I remember distinctly going into her office, and I was trying to take, I liked all the vocational. I wanted to, I took metal and wood and print shop and electrical shop, and I kept wanting to try to take those because I didn't want to take any real classes. And she was absolutely against it. And she said, "You will not do that. You will take these core courses so that you can graduate." And then Mrs. Easter, my second, actually third. She was my third black teacher, and I feel very fortunate. My first one was kindergarten. My second one was second grade, Mrs. Peoples. And she was my third and last black teacher of my career. And I feel like I'm lucky that I had three because I know people who didn't have any. She was like my grandmother, even though she was my mother's age. But she was no nonsense. And she was going to make sure that if we acted out, they knew who to call to make sure that we got it together. And I share this with you because I am pretty certain that even though I'm pretty smart, pretty good, pretty nice, that if it weren't for these people and the relationships that they forged with me in middle school, that my sister and I may not be standing where we are today. And I share this also because they have been at every significant event in my life since I left middle school. They've been at my sister's wedding. They've been to my sister's induction into the Hall of Fame in LA. They show up at the reunions. We're friends on Facebook. We have lunch with them. And they took a vested interest in kids who were, again, good kids, but may not have been your favorite. I think I could have been that kid, right? And so when we talk about the power of relationships, we cannot underestimate the life changes that can happen when we take the time to invest in those kids who are a little difficult or a lot difficult and who push our buttons, but it's worth it in the end. And they will remember you as being that person who made them feel good, who believed in them. These were the people in my life who did that. And I know that each of you could do the same thing up here for those people who did that for you. And so what I am doing right now is just helping you remember what got you through school. And knowing that those relationships are what's going to get our kids now through school. I want to show you I didn't test my audio. I hope it works. I'm going to show you a short video. It's called Know Your Why by Michael Jr. So I just want you to take a listen.
How do I know? A lot of people, when they think of the phrase, how do I know, they always want to put the what behind it. How do I know what I'm supposed to do? The question that you really should ask is, how do I know why I'm here? Because when you know your why, your what becomes more clear and more impactful. If you know, like for instance, people know that I do comedy, but that's what I do. My why is to inspire people to walk in purpose. So I can do comedy, I can write books, I can be in a movie, because all of it is motivated by my why. In fact, I have a new web series out called Michael Jr. Break Time. We probably just did the 6th episode. It's on YouTube. So every single Wednesday at 3 o'clock, we drop a new episode on YouTube of Michael Jr. Break Time. What it is it's me. I travel around the country and I do stand-up comedy, in case you didn't know. And in the middle of my comedy set sometime, I'll stop and just talk to my audience. And we've been filming this, and it's pretty cool. So we're in Winston-Salem. I'm gonna show you a clip from Winston-Salem. And I'm just talking to this guy in the audience, and he tells me that he's a musical instructor at a school. So I was like, all right, you're a musical instructor, can you sing? Let me hear you sing a song. So this is what happened at the last episode of Michael Jr.'s Break Time. Check it. So you're a musical director. Cool.
Yes, sir.
All right, so let me get a couple bars of like Amazing Grace. Can you do the first part of that? Go ahead.
Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me.
Wow. That bro could sing, you know what I'm saying? All right. Now, want you to give me the version as if your uncle just got out of jail, you got shot in the back when you was a kid. I'm just saying, let me see the hood version real quick, if you know which version I'm talking about. Just see if that exists. Let me see what you got.
Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now, right now I'm found, was blind, but now I see.
Let's go. Now. Okay. Here's what I want you to catch. The first time I asked him to sing, he knew what he was doing. The second time, he knew why he was doing it. When you know your why, your what becomes more impactful because you're walking towards or in your purpose.
So, knowing your why, like why we're doing this, and I think it changes. It gives us direction, and it changes what we're willing to do. It changes the risk we're willing to take. It changes. It just changes it all around, you know? So how do we get clear on why we're doing what we're doing so that we can find the passion behind it so that we can stay true to that path? I'll close out with this. This is Karen, and she is a project manager for me, and I told her a story about a book that I read, and one of the analogies in the book, and I read so much, but it's either Beverly Tatum, I think it's Beverly Tatum's book, but it could be Lisa Delpit's book, I can't remember, but I think it's Beverly Tatum's Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in a Cafeteria? And she talks about the moving walkway. And I think this is really important. She talks about the moving walkway as institutionalized racism. And part of the issue that we all experience is that when we think of racism, we make it very personal, but we don't think of it as an institution about how it perpetuates. So in this moving walkway, she says that the moving walkway, it just keeps moving. It doesn't require a whole lot of maintenance. It doesn't, you notice it's not really down. Actually, when I got to SFO the other day, they were working on it and I wanted to take a picture so bad because it was like, how often do you see that, right? It just keeps moving. And so when we think of a racist, as in the noun, the person, she says this is the person for whom the walkway is moving too slow. She says they're running on the walkway. And so when we hear racist, the only image that we have of what a racist is that. And we know we're not that, right? And so we get offended. We're upset. We suspend kids. We refer kids for calling us racist, right? And we know we're not there. But if we understand that we're walking on a path that's institutionally racist, and I am standing on that moving walkway, what is happening to all of us standing on the moving walkway? We are all moving forward. This is regardless of race. We are all part of the problem. And so for her, an anti-racist is someone who is willing to turn around on the moving walkway and push against it. That's why Karen's hands are out. But the problem is when you turn around on that walkway, and we see little kids do it, you're usually annoyed at them when they do it, right? But it's kind of cute too, for a minute, right? When you turn around, you are now confronted with your family, with your friends, with your colleagues, and they're all vested in you not being turned around. And you've all felt this if you're doing this work. You felt the push of people just saying, just let it go. Why is this such a big deal? You're making too big of a deal of it. right? You've got these people, and because they're in relationship with you, they have to be gentle about it. But as you keep pushing and you get further out, there's people who are not in relationship with you and they don't really care how you feel. And this goes back to what Candace was saying earlier. This is when you get into race fatigue, because you get finally tired enough of being pushed against with your hands out, trying to push and pave a way, that you stop walking. The problem is, when you stop walking, what happens to you? You're back moving in. You're moving backwards. Now, the difference is, if I stay turned around, I've now trained basically and conditioned the people around me that we don't say those things in front of Nancy because she'll start walking again. But it doesn't, I haven't changed behavior. I just changed how you behave in front of me. Now, in some cases, that's a starting point. I'm just gonna be honest with you. I'll take whatever I can get. If it means you say one less stupid thing in front of me, I'm really, really happy. But it's not enough. And it's not enough because how do you stay turned around? So I told you what keeps me turned around. I've told you, it's Mia and her sister Leah and Jackie. It's my 16 nieces and nephews. That when I get tired, I just leave the country for a minute, because then everything shifts up. Race goes off the list. Nationality goes to number 1. Gender's number 2. And then how much money I have is number 3, because it depends on whether or not I'm staying in a hostel or I get to fly or whatever. Right? But then I can't stay gone too long, because every time I think about my family and the people I love, I got to keep walking. So what keeps you walking? What turns you around in the first place? And then what keeps you walking? And that's what you have to figure out for yourself, because that's how we're going to change the outcomes that we see now. Success is a journey. It's not a destination. And so with that, I thank you very much for your time.